The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Starfleet has catalogued thousands of worlds, encountered hundreds of civilizations, mapped the intricate dance of matter and energy across the galaxy. But what happens when you discover not an alien species or a spatial anomaly, but a piece of your own past frozen in the void between stars? What happens when a man who went to sleep in one century wakes up to find that everything he knew, his world, his values, his very purpose, has been left behind in the dust of history? The USS Enterprise-D was conducting a routine survey of the Coriolis expanse, a region of space notable only for its unremarkable stellar phenomena, when Lieutenant Commander Data's console registered something impossible. Among the cosmic debris and frozen asteroids, sensors detected a faint power signature. Ancient, primitive, but unmistakably of Earth origin. "Captain," Data reported from Ops, his golden eyes reflecting the glow of his display. "I am detecting a vessel. Configuration matches early space exploration designs from Earth's late 20th century. Power readings are minimal, but present." Captain Jean-Luc Picard rose from his command chair, a mixture of curiosity and concern crossing his features. On screen. The view screen shimmered, revealing a battered spacecraft tumbling slowly through space. Its design was angular, utilitarian, a relic from an era when humanity still clawed its way into the cosmos with brute force and determination rather than elegant warp geometry. Scorched hull plating and outdated solar arrays marked it as a survivor of some forgotten mission, lost to time. "Analysis, Mr. Data?" "The vessel appears to be a Ranger 3 deep space exploration craft, launched in 1987 according to historical records. It was lost during a mission to study cosmic radiation beyond the solar system. All crew were presumed dead." Data paused, his head tilting with characteristic curiosity. "However, I am detecting a faint life sign aboard the vessel." The bridge fell silent. A life sign? From a ship that had been drifting through space for nearly 4 centuries. "Transporter range, Mr. Worf?" Picard asked. The Klingon security chief consulted his tactical display. "Yes, Captain. However, the power signature suggests cryogenic systems. If someone is in stasis, then we need to proceed with extreme caution." "Data, can we safely beam aboard without disrupting the life support?" "Affirmative, Captain. However, I recommend an away team to assess the situation first. The technology is primitive and may not respond well to direct transport of the individual." Picard nodded. "Assemble a team. Dr. Crusher, prepare sickbay for a possible revival from cryogenic suspension. And Mr. Data." He turned to his second officer. "I want you on that away team. Your technical expertise may be invaluable." 20 minutes later, Data materialized aboard the Ranger 3 alongside Commander Riker and Lieutenant Worf. Emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting long shadows through corridors designed for functionality over comfort. The air was thin, recycled through systems that had somehow continued operating for centuries beyond their intended lifespan. "Reading the life sign ahead," Riker reported, tricorder in hand. "Through that hatch." Worf forced the manual release, and the door groaned open. Inside, surrounded by banks of archaic equipment and frost-covered monitoring systems, was a cryogenic pod. Through the translucent cover, they could see a man, human, possibly in his 30s, wearing a flight suit with an American flag patch on the shoulder. Data's fingers moved across the pod's control panel, interpreting readouts that would have baffled most 24th century engineers. Remarkable. The cryogenic systems have maintained stable suspension for 379 years. The subject's cellular structure shows minimal degradation. "Can we revive him here?" Riker asked. "Negative. The process requires controlled medical supervision. However, I believe we can transport both the subject and the pod to sickbay without disruption." "Make it so." Dr. Beverly Crusher had seen many unusual medical cases during her career, but a 20th century human in cryogenic suspension ranked among the most challenging. The revival process took 6 hours of careful monitoring, gradually warming tissue, restarting metabolic processes that had been suspended since the late 1980s. When Captain William Buck Rogers opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was not the stars he'd left behind, but the curved ceiling of an advanced medical bay bathed in soft blue light. "Welcome back, Captain Rogers," Dr. Crusher said gently, her medical tricorder tracking his vital signs. "Please don't try to move too quickly. Your body has been in cryogenic suspension for a long time." Buck's vision focused slowly. The woman standing over him wore a blue uniform unlike anything he recognized. No NASA patches, no military insignia he could identify. The medical equipment around him looked more like something from a science fiction movie than a recovery room. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, throat raw from disuse. "Where am I?" "You're aboard the USS Enterprise. You're safe." "Enterprise?" Buck tried to sit up, but his muscles protested. "The carrier? How did I? Wait, what happened to Ranger 3? Beverly placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Your ship is secure. You've been through quite an ordeal, Captain Rogers. I'm Dr. Beverly Crusher, Chief Medical Officer. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This may be difficult to hear." Buck's military training kicked in, reading her expression. Bad news. He'd delivered it himself enough times. "Just give it to me straight, Doc. The year is 2367. You've been in cryogenic suspension for 379 years. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Buck stared at her, searching for any sign she was joking, confused, or somehow mistaken. But her eyes held only compassion and certainty. That's impossible. The mission was supposed to be..." He stopped, memory flooding back. The radiation storm. Emergency protocols. Climbing into the cryopod as a last resort, hoping rescue would come. "My crew?" Beverly's expression softened. "I'm sorry. You're the only survivor." Buck Rogers, astronaut, fighter pilot, man out of time, lay back against the biobed and stared at the ceiling of a future he never imagined he'd see. Somewhere beyond the walls of sickbay, a galaxy he didn't know waited to be discovered. But in that moment, all he could think about was everyone and everything he'd left behind, a world that had been dust for centuries. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The doors to sickbay whispered open, and Captain Jean-Luc Picard entered, his bearing formal but his expression warm. "Captain Rogers. I'm Jean-Luc Picard, commanding officer of this vessel. On behalf of Starfleet and the United Federation of Planets, welcome aboard." Buck managed a weak nod. "Federation of Planets?" Picard's slight smile carried understanding. "I imagine you have quite a few questions. When Dr. Crusher clears you, I'd like to invite you to my ready room. We have much to discuss, and I suspect the galaxy you've awakened to will seem rather different from the one you remember." Different, Buck thought, didn't even begin to cover it. The observation lounge offered a view that should have been impossible. Buck Rogers stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that had been drilled into him during his Air Force days, and tried to process what he was seeing. Stars streamed past at speeds that violated every principle of physics he'd learned at the academy. Not moving past. The ship was moving, faster than light itself, through a medium called warp space, that Commander Riker had tried to explain using terms like subspace geometry and relativistic compression. Buck had stopped him after the first minute. Some things, he'd decided, you just had to accept. "Coffee, Captain Rogers?" Picard gestured to a replicator panel in the wall. "Yeah, black. Strong as you've got." Buck turned from the window, still feeling unsteady on legs that had spent nearly 4 centuries frozen. "And you can drop the captain. I'm not commanding anything anymore. Just Buck." "Very well, Buck." Picard approached the replicator. "Coffee, black, double strength." A cup materialized in a shimmer of light, steam rising from liquid that hadn't existed seconds before. Buck stared at the cup as Picard handed it to him. Okay, that's how? A replicator. It rearranges matter at the molecular level to create virtually anything we need. Food, equipment, spare parts. Picard ordered tea for himself, Earl Grey hot, and settled into a chair. I realized this must be overwhelming. Dr. Crusher recommended we take your acclamation slowly, but you strike me as a man who prefers directness. You got that right. Buck sipped the coffee. It tasted real, better than real, actually. No bitterness, perfectly balanced. Even the coffee had evolved beyond what he remembered. Commander Riker gave me the broad strokes. No more countries, just this federation. Humanity made peace with itself, reached out to the stars, met aliens. Hell of a bedtime story. It's considerably more complex than that, but yes, essentially accurate. Picard studied him over his teacup. Tell me, what were you fighting for back in your time? The question caught Buck off guard. Fighting for? You were a military officer. The Cold War was still ongoing in 1987, if I recall my history correctly. The world was divided between competing ideologies, nuclear weapons pointed at one another across ideological fault lines. What did you believe you were protecting? Buck considered the question. Freedom, I guess. The American way of life. Making sure the other guy didn't get an advantage that would let them push us around. He paused. Sounds pretty simple when I say it out loud. Not simple. Human. Picard leaned forward. But that world no longer exists, Buck. Humanity nearly destroyed itself in the mid-21st century. World War III, the post-atomic horror. Millions died. When we finally crawled out of the ashes, we realized the old ways of thinking had brought us to the brink of extinction. First contact with the Vulcans showed us there was another path. Vulcans. Right. The guys with the pointed ears. Buck had met Lieutenant Commander Data earlier, an android who was more human than some people Buck had known. If Starfleet had artificial people, he supposed aliens weren't that much stranger. And everyone just gave up money? Borders? Competition? Not gave up. Evolved beyond. Picard's voice carried conviction. When humanity gained the ability to provide for everyone's basic needs, food, shelter, medicine, the old economic systems became obsolete. People began to work not for survival or wealth, but for self-improvement and the betterment of all. We explore not to conquer, but to understand. We seek out new life and new civilizations not to exploit them, but to learn from them. Buck set down his coffee cup. Captain Picard, I've got to level with you. That sounds like a hell of a dream. But I've seen enough of human nature to know people don't just stop wanting more. Power, resources, advantage, that's hardwired into us. Is it? Picard's expression remained patient. Or is it simply what we believed because we lived in a world of scarcity and fear? I won't tell you humanity is perfect, Buck. We still struggle. We still face difficult choices. But we've learned that diversity is a strength, that cooperation yields better results than conflict, and that the pursuit of knowledge is more rewarding than the pursuit of dominance. And what about when you run into someone who doesn't share that philosophy? What about enemies? We have adversaries, yes. The Borg, the Romulans, others. But our first recourse is always diplomacy, understanding. We have a Prime Directive. A fundamental principle that forbids us from interfering in the natural development of other civilizations. Even when we could impose our will, we choose not to. Buck stood, pacing the observation lounge like a caged animal. 379 years. Everyone he'd known was dead. His parents gone. His friends from the squadron dust. Sarah, the woman he'd been planning to propose to when he got back from the mission. She'd lived her entire life and died centuries ago without ever knowing what happened to him. And now these people expected him to just accept that everything he believed, everything he'd fought for, was obsolete? I need some time. Buck said finally. It's a lot. Of course. Picard stood. Commander Data has prepared quarters for you. I've also arranged for you to have access to our computer database and holodeck facilities. They may help you understand this era better. Holodeck? A remarkable technology. It uses photons and force fields to create realistic simulations. You could recreate your home, experience historical events, or simply explore environments from across the galaxy. Many find it useful for perspective. Buck nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted perspective. What he wanted was to wake up from this fever dream and find himself back in 1987, preparing for re-entry, looking forward to seeing Earth again. But that Earth was gone. And he was stranded in a future he didn't understand. Commander Data found Buck an hour later, sitting in the quarters Starfleet had assigned him, staring at a computer terminal that displayed images of Earth, the Earth of 2367. Gleaming cities integrated into natural landscapes. Vast orbital installations. Starships coming and going from a planet that looked simultaneously familiar and alien. Captain Rogers, Data said from the doorway. May I enter? Just Buck. And yeah, come in. Data stepped inside, his movements precise and controlled. I wish to check on your acclimation. Dr. Crusher informed me that revival from extended cryogenic suspension can cause psychological distress in addition to physical challenges. I'm fine. Buck gestured at the terminal. Just trying to figure out what the hell happened to my planet. A considerable amount of change has occurred in 379 years. Data agreed. However, I believe I may have a unique perspective on your situation. How's that? I am an artificial life form, Buck. I was activated 26 years ago with no memory of previous existence. In a sense, I am perpetually adapting to a world I did not organically grow into. I understand the challenge of learning to function in a context that feels simultaneously familiar and alien. Buck studied the android. Data's face showed no emotion, but there was something in his tone, genuine empathy, or at least the attempt at it. You trying to tell me I'm like a robot who just got switched on? No. I am suggesting that adaptation is possible, even when the circumstances seem insurmountable. Data tilted his head. You were selected for deep space exploration, Buck. That suggests you possess qualities beyond mere technical skill, curiosity, resilience, the ability to function in isolation and uncertainty. Those qualities have not changed. Yeah, well, I was exploring space. Not time. An interesting distinction. However, you are now in a position to explore something perhaps more profound, humanity's potential. You have witnessed both where we came from and where we have arrived. That perspective is extraordinarily rare. Buck turned back to the terminal. Data, can this thing show me? I mean, can I look up what happened? To people I knew? Yes. The historical database is comprehensive, though records from the late 20th century can be incomplete due to World War III's disruption. I need to know what happened to Sarah Deering. She lived in California, worked as a journalist. He trailed off. Data's fingers moved across the terminal with inhuman speed. I have located 7 individuals named Sarah Deering in California during that period. If you can provide additional identifying information. Forget it. Buck stood abruptly. It doesn't matter. She's gone. Everyone's gone. I'm the last man standing from a world that doesn't exist anymore. That is not entirely accurate, Data said quietly. Your world led to this one. Without the struggles, sacrifices, and achievements of your era, the Federation would not exist. In that sense, Captain Rogers, you are not the last remnant of a dead world. You are a bridge between humanity's past and its future. Buck wanted to argue, to reject the android's optimistic interpretation. But something in Data's words resonated. He'd spent his career pushing boundaries, going where others couldn't or wouldn't. Maybe this was just another mission, the strangest one he'd ever flown, but a mission nonetheless. Data, this holodeck thing Picard mentioned. Could it show me what combat looks like in this century? I need to understand how you people fight. We endeavor to avoid combat when possible. However, historical recreations of various conflicts are available. May I ask why you wish to examine this particular aspect of our society? Buck met the android's golden eyes. Because in my experience, Doc, you learn more about people by how they handle a fight than how they handle peace. And if I'm going to survive in this future, I need to know what I'm dealing with. Data considered this. An interesting hypothesis. I will compile several scenarios for your review. However, I must warn you, you may find our approach to conflict unsatisfying. Let me be the judge of that. As Data departed, Buck turned back to the window. Outside, the stars continued their impossible dance, streaking past at velocities that shouldn't exist. Somewhere out there, in this vast federation of peaceful explorers and enlightened philosophers, there had to be a place for a fighter pilot from the 20th century. He just had to figure out what that place was before this future decided he was obsolete. The bridge of the USS Enterprise-D hummed with quiet efficiency as the ship approached the Federation Cardassian border. Buck Rogers stood near the tactical station, hands clasped behind his back, observing the crew with the analytical eye of a military officer. In the 3 days since his revival, he'd spent hours reviewing Starfleet protocols, historical databases, and tactical simulations. What he'd learned both impressed and troubled him. These people had forgotten how to fight. Oh, they had weapons, phasers that could stun or disintegrate, photon torpedoes that made nuclear warheads look like firecrackers, shields that could deflect almost anything. But they'd wrapped all that firepower in layers of procedure, diplomatic protocol, and something Picard called the measured response. Captain, Lieutenant Worf reported from Tactical, his deep voice cutting through Buck's thoughts. Sensors detect a Cardassian patrol craft crossing into Federation space. They are not responding to hails. Picard leaned forward in his command chair. Yellow alert. Mr. Worf, continue hailing on all frequencies. Mr. Data, what is their heading? They appear to be on course for the Bajoran colony on Volan 3. Data replied. At current speed, they will achieve orbit in 14 minutes. The colony is unarmed. Riker added, rising from his seat. 3,000 civilians, most of them refugees from the occupation. Buck watched Picard's jaw tighten. The captain had explained the Cardassian situation during one of their conversations, a militaristic empire that had brutally occupied the planet Bajorans for decades, withdrawing only recently and leaving behind a traumatized population. The Federation had been helping resettle Bajoran refugees, which the Cardassians saw as interference in their sphere of influence. Intercept course, Ensign, Picard ordered. Maximum warp. Mr. Worf, arm photon torpedoes but do not achieve weapons lock. I will not fire the first shot. Buck couldn't help himself. Captain, if I may. Picard glanced back. Yes, Buck? Sir, they've violated your border and they're heading for an unarmed colony. In my book, that's hostile intent. Why are we giving them time to get there? Because we don't know their intentions, Picard replied evenly. They may have a legitimate reason for crossing the border. A medical emergency, perhaps, or a navigation malfunction. Or they could be testing your response time. Buck stepped closer. How many colonies have the Cardassians hit in the past year? Riker's expression darkened. Intelligence suggests they've conducted raids on 12 settlements along the border, but nothing we can prove definitively. So they probe, you respond with hails and measured reactions, and they learn your patterns. Buck shook his head. Captain, I respect what you're trying to do here, but I've seen this playbook before. You give an aggressor room to maneuver, they'll take it every time. Perhaps in your century that was true, Picard said, his tone still patient but with an edge of steel. But we are not at war with the Cardassians. A treaty exists. If we violate it based on suspicion alone, we become the aggressor. The Enterprise dropped out of warp, the main view screen showing the Cardassian vessel, a Gala-class warship bristling with weapons, and beyond it, the blue-green curve of Volan 3. Hailing frequencies open, Captain, Worf announced. Cardassian vessel, this is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation starship Enterprise. You have entered Federation space without authorization. State your intentions immediately. The view screen flickered, revealing a Cardassian officer with the characteristic neck ridges and serpentine bearing of his species. Gul Torin, according to the display. His smile was predatory. Captain Picard? How prompt of you! We are merely conducting a survey of this sector. Nothing that concerns the Federation. This sector is Federation territory under the terms of the treaty, Picard replied. The colony on Volan 3 is under our protection. Protection? Torin's smile widened. How interesting. The same protection you offered the Bajoran colonies you've been stealing from Cardassian influence? Your Federation grows bold, Picard. Buck watched the exchange, his tactical instincts screaming. The Cardassian was stalling, running scans, gathering intelligence. Every second Picard spent talking was a second the enemy spent preparing. We have offered humanitarian aid to refugees, Picard said. That is hardly theft. Now I must insist you withdraw immediately or we will escort you back across the border. Escort? Torin laughed. I think not, Captain. But I will leave, for now. There will be other opportunities to discuss the Federation's expansion into territories that do not concern you. The Cardassian vessel turned, impulse engines flaring as it moved back toward the border at a leisurely pace. Not the speed of a ship worried about pursuit. The speed of a ship that had accomplished its mission. Stand down from yellow alert, Picard ordered once the Cardassians crossed back into their own space. Mr. Data, I want a full analysis of their sensor sweeps. They conducted extensive scans of Volan 3, Captain. Defense capabilities, population centers, orbital approach vectors. They were casing the joint, Buck said flatly. And you let them. The bridge fell silent. Several officers turned to look at him, expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. Picard rose from his chair, his voice calm but firm. Buck, a word in my ready room. Number 1, you have the bridge. The ready room door whispered shut behind them. Picard gestured to a chair, but Buck remained standing, too wired to sit. You disagree with how I handled that situation, Picard said, moving to stand behind his desk but not sitting either. Captain, no disrespect intended, but yeah, I disagree. That Cardassian was running reconnaissance on an unarmed colony, and you gave him a free look because of treaty protocols. And what would you have done? Opened fire on a vessel that had not fired on us? Violated our own treaty obligations on the basis of suspicion? I would have made it clear that crossing that border has consequences. Lock weapons, close to combat range. Make them understand that the next time they pull that stunt, they won't get a conversation, they'll get a fight. Picard's eyes narrowed. And when the Cardassian High Command uses that as justification to claim Federation aggression? When they use it as a pretext to attack multiple colonies simultaneously? When we find ourselves in a war that could have been avoided through restraint? You're already in a war, Captain. They just haven't made it official yet. Buck gestured toward the window, toward the border that lay beyond. I've read your files on the Cardassians. Occupation of Bajorans, 50 years of systematic oppression. Torture, forced labor, cultural genocide. And when they finally pulled out, they left the planet stripped bare. Does that sound like a species that respects diplomacy? No, Picard admitted. But it sounds like a species we must be very careful with. Buck, I understand your frustration. In your time, military posturing and shows of strength were standard operating procedure. But the Federation has learned, often through bitter experience, that such approaches frequently escalate conflicts rather than preventing them. And what about when talking doesn't work? What happens to those 3,000 colonists the next time Gul Torin decides to do more than just scan them? Then we will defend them. With the full force of Starfleet if necessary. Picard's voice carried absolute conviction. But I will not transform a tense situation into an active conflict because I lack the patience for diplomacy. Buck ran a hand through his hair, frustration mounting. You talk about patience like it's a virtue. Where I come from, hesitation gets people killed. And where I come from, Picard replied, his tone gentle but unyielding, hasty action has cost billions of lives. World War III, Buck. The eugenics wars before that. Humanity nearly destroyed itself because we couldn't resist the urge to shoot first and question later. He moved around the desk, standing face to face with the 20th century pilot. I am not naive about the galaxy's dangers. But I have to believe, we all have to believe, that there is a better way than perpetual conflict. Buck met his gaze. And if you're wrong? If your better way gets people killed because you gave the enemy too many chances? Then I will carry that burden. Picard's expression held profound weariness, the weight of command that transcended centuries. I have made mistakes, Buck. I have lost people under my command. But I would rather live with the consequences of trying for peace than the certainty of war. The two men stood in silence, separated by nearly 400 years of human evolution but united by the fundamental challenge of command, the burden of making choices when lives hung in the balance. Finally, Buck nodded. I hear you, Captain. And I'm trying to understand. But you need to understand something too. I'm a fighter pilot. I'm trained to see threats and eliminate them before they eliminate me. You're asking me to rewire everything I know about survival. I'm not asking you to stop being vigilant, Picard said. I'm asking you to consider that vigilance doesn't always require violence. Stay on the bridge, Buck. Observe. Learn how we operate. And if you see something we're missing, if your perspective catches something our protocols overlook, then speak up. But trust that we've survived this long for a reason. Fair enough. Buck extended his hand, and Picard shook it. But for the record, Captain, I still think you should have rattled that Cardassian's cage a little harder. Picard allowed himself a slight smile. Noted. Dismissed. In the corridor outside the ready room, Buck nearly collided with Lieutenant Worf, who had apparently been waiting for him. Captain Rogers? The Klingon rumbled. A moment. Yeah, what's up? Worf glanced around, ensuring they were alone. I overheard your conversation with the captain. About the Cardassian vessel. And you're here to tell me I'm out of line? No. Worf's expression was difficult to read, but his eyes held something Buck recognized, the frustration of a warrior forced to watch enemies maneuver unopposed. I am here to tell you that not everyone on this ship believes diplomacy is always the answer. The Cardassians respect strength. They see patience as weakness. Buck studied the Klingon security chief. You agree with me. I agree that there are times when a show of force prevents conflict better than endless dialogue. But I also serve under Captain Picard, and his record speaks for itself. He has saved this ship more times than I can count, often through methods I would not have chosen. Worf's jaw tightened. It is difficult to balance warrior instincts with Starfleet principles. Tell me about it. Buck leaned against the bulkhead. You ever feel like you're in the wrong century, Worf? Every day, the Klingon admitted. But then I remember that honor is not only found in battle. It is found in discipline, in loyalty, in choosing the harder path when the easier one would compromise our values. He paused. You will find your place here, Captain Rogers. But it may not be the place you expect. As Worf walked away, Buck considered his words. The harder path. Maybe that's what this future represented, not the absence of conflict, but the discipline to seek alternatives before embracing it. But discipline didn't help the 3,000 colonists on Volan 3 when the Cardassians came back. And Buck had a sinking feeling they would come back. Soon. 10 forward was nearly empty at 0200 hours ship's time. Buck Rogers sat at a table near the observation windows, nursing a drink that Guinan, the enigmatic bartender with the elaborate hats, had called Aldebaran whiskey. It tasted like smoke and starlight, and it was doing absolutely nothing to help him sleep. 3 days of adjustment had become a week. A week had become 2. And Buck was starting to realize that adapting to the 24th century wasn't about learning new technology or memorizing Federation protocols. It was about accepting that everything he believed about human nature might be incomplete. "Mind if I join you?" Buck looked up to find Commander Riker standing there with his own drink. "Free galaxy, Commander." Riker settled into the opposite chair with the easy confidence Buck had noticed during their first meeting. The Enterprise's first officer had the build of someone who kept himself in fighting shape, and unlike some of the crew, he didn't seem entirely comfortable with Picard's diplomatic approach either. "Couldn't sleep?" Riker asked. "Sleep schedules are for people who belong in their own time." Buck took another sip. "I keep dreaming I'm back on Ranger 3, except when I wake up from cryo, everyone's a skeleton and the ship's falling apart. Then I actually wake up and realize the dream isn't that far off." "That's rough." Riker's sympathy seemed genuine. "For what it's worth, I've read your file. You were one hell of a pilot in your day. Test flights that should have killed you, combat scenarios that most wouldn't have survived. The psych profile says you volunteered for the deep space mission because you wanted to be part of something bigger than yourself." "Yeah, well, I got that wish. About 400 years bigger than I planned. The offer still stands, you know. Captain Picard would authorize training for you to serve on the Enterprise. Helm, navigation, tactical, you'd pick it up faster than most Academy graduates." Buck had heard this pitch before. Starfleet wanted to give him purpose, integrate him into their perfect society. But something about it felt wrong, like wearing someone else's uniform. "I appreciate it, Commander. But I'm not sure I'm Starfleet material. Not this version of Starfleet, anyway. Because we don't shoot first? Because you've got rules for everything. Prime Directive says don't interfere. Treaty says don't provoke. Protocol says hail 3 times before defending yourself. Where I come from, hesitation gets people killed." Riker swirled his drink. "You know, my father was a lot like you. Career military, believed in strength and direct action. We didn't speak for years because I couldn't meet his expectations." He met Buck's eyes. "But I learned something serving under Captain Picard. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is nothing. Sometimes restraint takes more courage than action." Pretty words. But that Cardassian ship that scanned Volan 3? Intel reports say 3 similar vessels have been spotted near Federation colonies this week. They're planning something, Commander, and your restraint is giving them time to do it. You're probably right. Riker's admission surprised Buck. But if we escalate every border incident into a shooting war, we're no better than the empires we claim to have evolved beyond. The Federation's strength isn't just our weapons, it's our principles. Lose those, and we've lost everything that makes us different." Before Buck could respond, a Ferengi materialized at their table as if summoned by the conversation itself. Short, large-eared, wearing an elaborate suit that screamed wealth and ambition, he grinned with too many teeth. "Captain Rogers. Commander Riker. What a fortunate coincidence finding you both here." Riker's expression soured. "Daimon Gax. I thought you were barred from this ship. A misunderstanding, I assure you. All charges of attempting to purchase classified Starfleet technology were completely unfounded." The Ferengi turned his attention to Buck, eyes gleaming with calculation. "But I'm not here to discuss the past. I'm here to discuss opportunity with the famous man out of time." "Not interested," Buck said flatly. "Oh, but you haven't heard my proposition yet." Gax pulled up a chair uninvited. "You see, I've been following your story with great interest. A military officer from an era when humans still understood the value of profit, suddenly thrust into this socialist paradise where nobody owns anything and everyone pretends to be happy about it. Must be disorienting." "Daimon Gax," Riker began, but Buck held up a hand. "Let him talk, Commander. I'm curious where this goes." Gax's grin widened. "I represent certain interests who believe your unique perspective has value. You understand tactics, combat, the art of leverage. Concepts the Federation has forgotten in their pursuit of enlightenment. We're willing to offer you something Starfleet can't. And what's that? Purpose. Profit. Freedom. Gax leaned forward conspiratorially. The Ferengi Alliance has contracts throughout the quadrant that require military consultation, training militia forces, advising on defensive strategies, providing expertise to colonies that can't rely on Starfleet's protection because they're not Federation members. It's all perfectly legal, I assure you. You want to hire me as a mercenary. Buck translated. Such an ugly term. I prefer independent security consultant. The pay would be substantial, gold-pressed platinum, which actually has value unlike your Federation's idealistic philosophy. You'd have your own ship, your own crew, the freedom to operate without endless committees and regulations telling you how to do your job. Riker stood abruptly. This conversation is over. Daimon Gax, you have 10 seconds to leave 10 forward before I have security escort you to the brig. No need for hostility, Commander. I'm simply offering Captain Rogers a choice. Something your Federation claims to value. Gax produced a small device and placed it on the table. A communication device. If you're interested in hearing more, Buck, and I suspect you are, contact me. The offer expires in 48 hours. The Ferengi departed with exaggerated courtesy, leaving the device on the table like a coiled serpent. Don't even think about it, Riker warned. The Ferengi see everything as a transaction. Gax doesn't care about your well-being. He sees you as a commodity. As opposed to Starfleet, which sees me as a rehabilitation project? Buck picked up the device, examining it. Look, Commander, I appreciate what you and Picard are trying to do. But maybe I don't fit in this future. Maybe I'm better off finding my own way. Working for Ferengi arms dealers and training militias in border territories? That's not finding your way, Buck. That's running from the challenge of adapting. Or maybe it's accepting that some people are meant to fight, not explore. Buck pocketed the device. I'm not making any promises. But I'm also not closing doors just because Starfleet doesn't approve of what's behind them. Riker's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Your choice. But remember, the Federation didn't become what it is by taking the easy path. We became this because people chose to be better than their circumstances demanded. You were an explorer once, Buck. You volunteered for a mission that should have been a death sentence because you wanted to expand human knowledge. That person is still in there somewhere. He left Buck alone with the Ferengi communicator and a galaxy full of choices that all felt wrong. Buck returned to his quarters to find a visitor waiting in the corridor. Lieutenant Commander Data stood with the patience of a being who didn't experience boredom, his hands clasped behind his back. Data. Little late for a social call, isn't it? I do not require sleep, Buck. I noticed you met with Daimon Gax and wanted to provide additional context that may inform your decision. Let me guess, Starfleet sent you to talk me out of it. No. Captain Picard believes you must make your own choice. However, he asks that I ensure you have complete information. Data's golden eyes studied him with mechanical precision that somehow felt more honest than human guile. May I enter? Buck keyed open his quarters, and they stepped inside. Data waited patiently as Buck tossed the Ferengi communicator onto a table and dropped into a chair. All right, Data. Give me the complete information. Daimon Gax represents a consortium of Ferengi merchants who provide military equipment and training to various factions along the Federation Cardassian border. While technically legal under Ferengi law, their activities frequently destabilize regions and prolong conflicts. 3 colonies that employed their security consultants were subsequently destroyed when the Cardassians interpreted the military buildup as justification for preemptive strikes. So these people Gax wants me to help. They'd be sitting ducks. Not immediately. The training and equipment would make them more capable of defending themselves in the short term. However, historical analysis suggests a 93% probability that enhanced military capability in border colonies leads to Cardassian military response within 6 months. The result is typically complete destruction of the colony and significant loss of life. Buck leaned back, processing. Gax knows this? Almost certainly. However, the Ferengi profit from both the initial contracts and the subsequent reconstruction efforts. From a purely economic standpoint, prolonged conflict is preferable to stable peace. Son of a bitch. Buck had known plenty of war profiteers in his time, but at least they'd had the decency to pretend they cared about something other than money. And Starfleet just lets them operate. Federation law cannot govern non-Federation citizens in non-Federation space. We can warn colonies of the risks, but ultimately they are free to make their own choices. Many choose security over uncertainty, even when that security is illusory. That's what Gax is counting on. Buck picked up the communicator again, turning it over in his hands. He thinks I'm desperate enough, displaced enough, that I'll take the deal without looking too hard at the consequences. Are you? Data asked with characteristic directness. I don't know, Data. I honestly don't know. Buck set the device down. Every instinct I have says I don't belong here. Starfleet's too soft, too bound by rules that get people killed. But running off to train militia for Ferengi profit margins? That's not who I am either. Then perhaps the question is not where you belong, but who you wish to become. Data tilted his head. You were frozen in time, Buck. Most humans see that as a tragedy, everything you knew erased. But I see it as opportunity. You are not bound by the gradual evolution that shaped the rest of humanity. You can choose which aspects of your past to preserve and which aspects of this future to embrace. That's a hell of a philosophical position for an android. I spend considerable time contemplating existence, as I am uncertain of my own humanity. In that sense, we share a common question: what does it mean to be who we are when the world around us insists we should be something different? Buck studied Data, seeing the android, the artificial person, in a new light. He'd been so focused on his own displacement that he hadn't considered others might be fighting similar battles. You ever figure out the answer? Not yet. But I believe the search itself has value. Data stood. One additional piece of information, Buck. Volan 3 has requested that you visit their colony. The Bajoran refugees there learned of your revival and wish to meet the human who survived impossible circumstances. They see your story as inspirational. Inspirational? Buck laughed bitterly. I'm a relic who can't adapt to the future. You are a survivor who refuses to surrender his principles even when the world changes around him. To people who have lost everything. Their world, their culture, their freedom, that resilience means something. After Data left, Buck sat in silence, the Ferengi communicator gleaming on the table like a promise of escape. Or a trap. Maybe both. 48 hours to decide who Buck Rogers would become in the 24th century. The clock was ticking. The shuttlecraft Copernicus descended through Volan 3's atmosphere, carrying Buck Rogers toward a decision he hadn't fully committed to making. Lieutenant Worf piloted with characteristic Klingon precision, his massive hands steady on the controls as they passed through wispy clouds toward the settlement below. The Bajoran refugees have prepared a gathering in your honor, Worf rumbled. They do not often trust outsiders, but Data's recommendation carried weight. Yeah, well, I'm not sure what they expect from me. Buck watched the landscape scroll past, agricultural domes, prefabricated housing, the infrastructure of a people trying to rebuild after decades of oppression. I'm just a guy who took a long nap. You underestimate the power of survival. Worf's eyes remained on the controls, but his tone carried conviction. The Bajorans spent 50 years under Cardassian occupation. Torture, forced labor, cultural erasure. Many died. Those who survived did so through resilience and refusal to surrender their identity. They see that same quality in you. The shuttle landed on a cleared pad near the colony's central administration building. As Buck and Worf disembarked, a group of Bajorans waited to greet them, men and women with the characteristic nose ridges of their species, wearing simple clothing that somehow maintained dignity despite its utilitarian design. An older Bajoran woman stepped forward, her weathered face carrying the weight of survival. Captain Rogers. I am Kira Taban, Settlement Administrator. Welcome to Volan 3. Buck extended his hand, and she clasped it firmly. Just Buck, ma'am. And I'm honored by the invitation, though I'm not sure I deserve it. You survived the impossible and refused to let it break you. That alone makes you worthy of respect. Kira gestured toward the settlement. Come. We've prepared food, and our people wish to hear your story. The gathering hall was crowded with Bajorans, easily 200 people pressed into a space designed for half that number. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, elderly refugees leaned on walking sticks, and everyone's eyes tracked Buck with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. These weren't the curious stares of Enterprise crew members trying to figure out the man from the past. These were the eyes of people searching for hope. Kira introduced him, her words translated by a universal translator that Buck still found unsettling. The technology let him understand dozens of languages, but it also reminded him how alien this galaxy truly was. 379 years in cryogenic sleep, Kira concluded. Everyone he knew gone. His world transformed beyond recognition. Yet he endures. Captain Rogers, will you share your thoughts with us? Buck stood, acutely aware that he'd never been good at speeches. Give him a cockpit and a mission, and he was fine. Put him in front of a crowd expecting inspiration, and he was lost. I'm not sure what I can tell you that you don't already know, he began, voice rough. You've all survived things I can't imagine. Occupation, displacement, loss. Me? I just got lucky with some faulty cryo equipment. A murmur ran through the crowd. Not disapproval, something else. Recognition, maybe? But I'll tell you what I've learned in the past few weeks. Buck continued. Survival isn't about luck. It's about refusing to let circumstances define you. When I went into that cryopod, I thought I was dead. The mission had failed, my crew was gone, and I was drifting in space with no hope of rescue. But some part of me, the stubborn part, the fighter pilot part, refused to accept that ending. So I'm here. 400 years later, still trying to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do next. A young Bajoran boy, perhaps 10 years old, called out from the crowd. Are you scared? Kira started to shush him, but Buck held up a hand. Yeah, kid. I'm terrified. This future doesn't make sense to me. People don't fight for what they want, they talk endlessly about principles and treaties. Nobody owns anything, but somehow everyone has what they need. And worst of all, everyone expects me to just adapt like it's easy. He paused, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in dozens of faces. These people understood displacement. They'd been torn from their homes, their culture systematically attacked, their very identity challenged by occupiers who saw them as inferior. But here's what I'm realizing, Buck said, his voice strengthening. Adapting doesn't mean surrendering who you are. It means figuring out how to be yourself in a world that's changed. You're Bajoran, right? No matter what the Cardassians did, no matter how long the occupation lasted, you held on to that. You didn't let them erase you. The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. So maybe that's the answer for all of us who don't quite fit. We find ways to be who we are while learning to live in who we're becoming. I'm still Buck Rogers, fighter pilot from the 20th century. But maybe I can also be Buck Rogers, survivor of the 24th. Maybe both things can be true. The applause was thunderous, echoing off the prefabricated walls. Buck sat down, feeling simultaneously like a fraud and like he'd stumbled onto something true. After the gathering, Kira walked Buck through the settlement, showing him the gardens where Bajorans grew traditional crops, the shrine where they practiced their faith, the schools where children learned about a homeworld many had never seen. The Federation has been generous, Kira explained. Supplies, technology, protection. But some of my people worry we're losing ourselves in the process. Becoming Federation citizens rather than Bajorans. Can't you be both? Buck asked, echoing his own earlier words. Perhaps. But it requires vigilance. She stopped at the settlement's perimeter, where sensor arrays and defensive shields created an invisible barrier. The Cardassians won't forgive us for surviving, Captain Rogers. They see our existence as a reminder of their failure to completely break us. And the Federation's protection comes with expectations. Follow their rules, accept their way of doing things, become what they believe we should be. Buck recognized the frustration in her voice. You're thinking about other options. Daimon Gax contacted me 3 days ago. Kira's expression hardened. He offered weapons, training, defensive systems that would let us protect ourselves without relying on Starfleet. The price was substantial, but manageable if we mortgage our future harvests. And you're considering it. Shouldn't I? Kira turned to face him directly. The Cardassians probe our defenses weekly. Starfleet sends a patrol every few days, but they can't be here constantly. What happens when the Cardassians decide talking is over and action begins? Do we trust that Picard's diplomacy will save us, or do we take responsibility for our own survival? It was the same question Buck had been wrestling with. The same choice Gax had offered him, pragmatic self-reliance versus idealistic trust in Federation principles. I don't know, Buck admitted. In my time, I would have said arm up, train hard, be ready for the worst. But data showed me what happens when colonies take Gax's deal. The Cardassians see it as justification for preemptive strikes. You'd be trading uncertain vulnerability for certain destruction. So we do nothing? Trust that diplomacy will protect us? I didn't say that. Buck leaned against the sensor array housing. There's got to be a middle ground. Federation principles without Federation weakness. Self-reliance without playing into Cardassian hands. If you find it, Captain Rogers, please inform me. Because right now, I see only 2 paths: surrender our security to Starfleet's idealism, or take matters into our own hands and risk everything. Kira's voice dropped. Daimon Gax gave me 48 hours to decide. The same deadline he gave you, I suspect. Buck's eyes narrowed. You know about his offer to me? The Ferengi are many things, but subtle is not among them. He's been recruiting throughout the border territories. Former military officers, tactical consultants, anyone who can help colonies defend themselves. And he's using you as his prize recruit. If the legendary Buck Rogers trusts us, he tells potential clients, surely we're legitimate. Son of a bitch. Buck straightened. He's leveraging my reputation to sell weapons contracts. Ferengi rule of acquisition number 74, knowledge equals profit. Kira's smile was bitter. He saw an opportunity in both of us. Displaced people desperate for control over our own fates. But desperation makes poor decisions, Captain. I learned that during the occupation. Before Buck could respond, Worf's combadge chirped. Lieutenant Worf to Captain Rogers. We have a situation. 3 Cardassian vessels just entered the sector and are on approach to Volan 3. The Enterprise is too far away to intercept. Kira's face went pale. How long until they arrive? 17 minutes, Worf replied grimly. I am attempting to raise Starfleet command, but even at maximum warp, the nearest ship is 40 minutes out. Buck's training kicked in immediately. What are your defensive capabilities? Minimal, Kira admitted. We have basic shields, but they won't hold against sustained fire. No weapons beyond personal phasers. We're farmers and refugees, Captain Rogers, not soldiers. Then we need to evacuate. 3,000 people in 17 minutes? Impossible. We have transport capacity for perhaps 500, and only if we abandon everything we've built. Buck turned to Worf, his mind racing through tactical scenarios. The shuttle, can we use it to buy time? The Copernicus is a Type 6 shuttlecraft. Worf replied, his warrior's instinct clearly aligned with Buck's thinking. Shields, phasers, limited maneuverability. Against 3 Gala-class warships. He paused. We would last perhaps 90 seconds. 90 seconds the evacuation doesn't have. Buck made his decision. Worf, power up the shuttle. We're going to make those 90 seconds count. Buck Rogers. Kira gripped his arm. You'll be killed. This isn't your fight. Ma'am, with all due respect, I've been looking for my fight since I woke up in this century. Buck met her eyes. Maybe this is it. Maybe showing 3 Cardassian warships that someone's willing to stand up to them. Even in a shuttle that's got no business taking them on, maybe that's worth more than survival. Worf's expression showed approval. A warrior's death. There is honor in this, Buck Rogers. Let's aim for a warrior's victory instead. Buck started toward the landing pad. Kira, get your people to the shelters. If we can convince the Cardassians this colony's more trouble than it's worth, they might back off. And if they don't? Buck flashed a grin that felt like the first genuine expression he'd worn since awakening. Then at least I'll go down fighting. That's more than I got last time. As he and Worf ran toward the Copernicus, Buck realized the Ferengi communicator was still in his quarters on the Enterprise. Gax's 48-hour deadline would expire without an answer. But Buck Rogers had already made his choice. The shuttlecraft Copernicus rose from Volan 3's surface like a defiant insect descending to challenge 3 circling hawks. Buck Rogers gripped the co-pilot's controls, his hands moving across systems that were simultaneously alien and familiar. The principles of flight hadn't changed in 400 years: thrust, vectors, energy management. Only the scale had evolved. Cardassian vessels holding position at the edge of weapons range, Worf reported, his tactical display painting the 3 Gala-class warships in ominous red. They are scanning the colony. No response to our hails. They see us, Buck said, watching the sensor readouts. They're just trying to figure out if we're stupid or crazy. Perhaps both. Worf adjusted the shuttle shield configuration, maximizing forward protection. Starfleet will not approve of this action. Starfleet's 40 minutes away. By the time they get here to disapprove, we'll either have saved 3,000 people or be dead. Buck opened a channel to the settlement. Kira, status on evacuation? Shelters are at 80% capacity. The rest are loading onto transports, prioritizing children and elderly. We need 10 more minutes. Copy that. We'll buy you 15. Buck closed the channel and looked at Worf. You ever do anything this insane before? Regularly. Usually under Captain Picard's orders, though he frames it as strategic risk assessment rather than insanity. Good to know the future hasn't completely lost its mind. Buck targeted the lead Cardassian vessel. Alright, here's the play. We're going to buzz the lead ship, make them think we're attacking. If we're lucky, they'll focus on us long enough for the Enterprise to arrive. And if we are unlucky, then we find out if Starfleet's afterlife is anything like the one I grew up with. Buck pushed the throttle forward, and the Copernicus leaped toward the Cardassian formation. The 3 warships broke formation immediately, their tactical instincts kicking in even if they couldn't believe a single shuttle would actually engage them. Weapons lock, Worf announced. All 3 vessels targeting us. They're bluffing. They want to see what we do. Buck rolled the shuttle hard to port, angling for the gap between the lead ship and its wingman. If they fire, they risk hitting each other. Let's make them nervous about friendly fire. The Cardassian vessels adjusted, trying to maintain separation while tracking the shuttle's erratic approach. Buck's hands danced across the controls, pulling maneuvers that the shuttlecraft's inertial dampeners struggled to compensate for. His vision tunneled, instincts from decades of combat flying overriding conscious thought. Incoming! Worf shouted. A disruptor blast seared past the shuttle's starboard side, close enough that the shields flared brilliant orange. Buck jerked the Copernicus into a climb, inverting relative to the Cardassian formation and diving back toward them from above. Return fire, Buck ordered. Don't aim to hit, aim to harass. Worf unleashed a burst of phaser fire that splashed harmlessly against the lead vessel's shields, but the psychological impact was immediate. The Cardassians tightened their formation, their tactical doctrine programmed for engagement with similarly sized vessels, not a gnat that refused to die. Incoming transmission, Worf reported. They are demanding we stand down. Ignore it. How long until the Enterprise? 34 minutes. Damn. Buck pulled another hard turn, threading between two Cardassian vessels close enough that their shield harmonics created interference patterns. We need to stretch this out. Kira, you hearing this? Affirmative. The Bajoran's voice crackled with static. Captain Rogers, sensors show the Cardassians charging weapons for sustained fire. They're done playing. Buck glanced at Worf. Ideas? Retreat to the planet's upper atmosphere. The Cardassians will not want to risk firing near the settlement. Collateral damage would create diplomatic complications they cannot justify. Good call. Buck banked the shuttle toward Volan 3, pushing the engines to maximum. Kira, we're bringing the fight to your doorstep. Keep those people in shelters. The 3 Cardassian warships followed, their superior speed closing the distance rapidly. Disruptor fire carved through space around the fleeing shuttle, each blast closer than the last. Shields at 60%, Worf announced. We cannot sustain this assault. We don't need to sustain it. We just need to. Buck cut off as inspiration struck. Worf, can you modulate our shields to create a false warp signature? For what purpose? To make them think we're about to jump to warp inside the atmosphere. That's suicidal, which means they'll either think we're desperate enough to try it, or we've got backup incoming and we're trying to draw them into a trap. Worf's fingers flew across his console. Shield modulation configured. Initiating warp field fluctuations. The shuttle systems whined in protest as Worf created the illusion of a vessel preparing for a catastrophic warp jump. On the Cardassian sensors, it would read as either a suicide run or a deception. Either way, it would give them pause. Sure enough, the pursuing warships broke off, putting distance between themselves and what appeared to be an imminent antimatter explosion. Buck used the breathing room to dive deeper into the atmosphere, skimming along the cloud layer where the colony's sensor network could provide early warning of attack vectors. Status update? Buck asked. Evacuation complete, Kira reported. All personnel in reinforced shelters. We're as ready as we'll ever be. Enterprise ETA? 28 minutes, Worf said. However, I am detecting additional contacts. 2 more Cardassian vessels approaching from the opposite vector. Total hostiles 5. Buck felt his stomach drop. 5 Gala-class warships against 1 Galaxy-class starship and a shuttle that was already operating beyond its design limits. Even Picard's diplomatic genius couldn't talk their way out of those odds. Kira, tell me you've got something we can use. Emergency defenses, planetary weapons, anything? A long pause. Then, there is one option. Before the settlement was established, this planet was surveyed for strategic value. The Federation installed a network of automated defense satellites in high orbit, minimal firepower, but enough to deter raiders. They were deactivated when we arrived because the Federation didn't want to militarize a civilian colony. Can you reactivate them? Not from here. The control systems require Starfleet authorization codes and manual activation from the primary satellite. Buck looked at Worf. How far to the satellite network? Upper orbit. Approximately 40,000 kilometers. Worf's expression was grave. The Cardassians will intercept us before we reach it. Then we make sure they're too busy to intercept. Buck pulled the shuttle into a steep climb, breaking through the cloud layer toward space. Kira, we're going for the satellites. If we can activate them, they'll even the odds until the Enterprise arrives. Captain Rogers, there are 5 warships between you and those satellites. I noticed. We'll just have to be creative. The Copernicus burst from Volan 3's atmosphere like a missile, engines screaming as Buck pushed them past recommended tolerances. The 5 Cardassian warships immediately broke formation, 3 moving to intercept the shuttle while 2 took up bombardment positions above the colony. They are dividing their forces, Worf observed. Logical. Eliminate us while securing the primary target, which gives us an opening. Buck targeted the satellite network coordinates. Full power to engines. Reroute life support if you have to. Rerouting. Worf's hands moved with practiced efficiency. Shields are now at minimal capacity. We have perhaps 30 seconds before the Cardassians overtake us. Buck didn't respond. He was too focused on the tactical display, calculating vectors and intercepts, his mind working the problem the way he'd worked countless combat scenarios over Earth's skies. The difference was that those fights had been against human opponents, following predictable doctrine. The Cardassians were alien, their tactics shaped by decades of occupation warfare. But some principles were universal. Braking hard to starboard, now! The shuttle jerked into a trajectory that should have been impossible for a vessel its size. Inertial dampeners failed momentarily, slamming both men against their restraints hard enough to crack ribs. The three pursuing Cardassian vessels, locked into their intercept vectors, overshot by thousands of kilometers. That bought us time. Buck gasped, pain lancing through his chest. How much? 90 seconds before they realign. Worf was bleeding from a cut above his eye but looked almost pleased. An impressive maneuver. Broke every rule in your flight manual, I bet. Several. I approve. The satellite network loomed ahead. A constellation of automated defense platforms that had been dormant for months. Buck brought the shuttle alongside the primary control satellite, matching its orbital velocity. Life support systems failing, Worf reported. Hull temperature rising. We have perhaps 3 minutes before cascade failure. Then let's make them count. Buck grabbed an EVA suit from the shuttle's emergency locker. I'm going outside. You keep those Cardassians off me. With what weapons? Our phasers are depleted and shields are. Improvise, Lieutenant. I thought Klingon were good at that. Buck sealed the EVA suit and cycled through the airlock, magnetic boots engaging as he stepped onto the satellite's surface. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the drama playing out in their light. Below, Volan 3 curved blue and green, fragile and beautiful. The control panel was designed for remote access, but Buck's fingers found the manual override, a backup system installed for exactly this kind of emergency. Codes that Starfleet had given him during his integration briefing, never expecting he'd need them. Behind him, through the shuttle's transparent canopy, he could see Worf executing wild evasive maneuvers as the three Cardassian vessels closed in. Disruptor fire painted space in orange and red. Come on, Buck muttered, inputting the activation sequence. The satellite network hummed to life, weapons systems that had been sleeping suddenly awakening with predatory focus. Targeting sensors swept the area, identifying the Cardassian vessels as hostile based on their weapons signatures. 20 automated defense platforms opened fire simultaneously. The Cardassians, focused on the shuttle, didn't see it coming. Phaser beams struck shields from multiple angles, overwhelming their defensive geometry. One vessel took critical damage to its starboard nacelle, veering off in a controlled retreat. The other two broke formation, scrambling to adjust their tactics for a threat that attacked from all directions at once. Buck Rogers, Worf's voice crackled over the comm. Well done. However, we have another problem. Buck looked toward the planet and saw it immediately. The two Cardassian vessels in bombardment position were beginning their attack run on the settlement. And the Enterprise was still 23 minutes away. Buck Rogers had seconds to make a decision that would define whether 3,000 Bajoran refugees lived or died. The satellite network could target the two Cardassian vessels moving into bombardment position, but their firepower was designed to deter raiders, not stop dedicated warships. Meanwhile, the three vessels Worf had been evading were regrouping, and the Copernicus was hemorrhaging power from a dozen failing systems. Worf, can the satellites hold off those three ships? Negative. The Cardassians are adapting their shield frequencies. The satellites will be ineffective within 2 minutes. Buck stared at Volan 3, watching the two warships descend toward bombardment range. Kira's people were huddled in shelters that wouldn't survive sustained disruptor fire. The Federation's principles said wait for backup, trust in diplomacy, don't escalate. But Buck's instincts, honed over years of combat that predated those principles, said something different. Retarget all satellites on the 2 ships approaching the colony, Buck ordered. Full concentration of fire. That will leave us exposed to the 3 vessels behind us. I know. Get back to the shuttle and prep for atmospheric insertion. We're going down. Buck maglocked back to the airlock as Worf brought the Copernicus alongside. The moment he was aboard, Worf pushed the engines to maximum, diving toward Volan 3 in a trajectory that would either save the colony or create a very expensive crater. The satellite network opened fire as programmed, 20 platforms coordinating a devastating barrage against the 2 bombardment vessels. Shields flared, buckled, and one Cardassian ship broke off, trailing plasma from a ruptured conduit. The second continued its approach, gambling that it could withstand the assault long enough to complete its mission. They're going to fire, Buck said, watching the tactical display. Kira, brace for impact. The Cardassian warship unleashed a spread of disruptor torpedoes toward the settlement, but Buck had anticipated the trajectory. The Copernicus dropped from orbit like a stone, positioning itself between the weapons and the colony. Transferring all remaining power to forward shields, Worf announced. This will be unpleasant. The first torpedo struck the shuttle's shields like the fist of an angry god. Buck's vision whited out as the inertial dampeners failed completely, both men slamming against their restraints hard enough to crack the seat mountings. The second and third torpedoes followed in rapid succession, each impact degrading the shields further. Shield collapse imminent, Worf gasped, blood streaming from his nose. Hull integrity at 40%. Just a few more seconds. The fourth torpedo punched through the shields entirely, searing across the shuttle's dorsal hull. Alarms shrieked as atmosphere vented from a dozen ruptures. The Copernicus tumbled out of control, spinning toward the planet's surface in a death spiral. But the torpedoes meant for the settlement had been intercepted. Enterprise incoming! Worf shouted over the cacophony of failing systems. They have achieved weapons range! Through the wildly spinning viewport, Buck caught glimpses of the most beautiful sight he'd seen in 400 years. The USS Enterprise-D dropping out of warp with phaser arrays already firing. The massive Galaxy-class starship tore into the Cardassian formation with the fury of a protective parent defending its children. Captain Picard's voice cut through the chaos. All Cardassian vessels, this is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise. You have committed an act of war against the Federation Protectorate. Stand down immediately or I will interpret your continued presence as hostile intent and respond accordingly. The Cardassians, faced with a fully armed Galaxy-class starship and mounting casualties, made the rational choice. They broke off, jumping to warp in a coordinated retreat that spoke of pre-planned exit strategies. Copernicus, report status, Picard demanded. We're alive, Buck managed, fighting to stabilize the tumbling shuttle. Mostly. Could use a tractor beam, though. Engaging tractor beam now. Prepare for transport to sickbay. The world dissolved in a shimmer of transporter energy. Buck woke in sickbay with Dr. Crusher standing over him, medical tricorder in hand and disapproval written across her features. 3 cracked ribs, a concussion, second-degree burns on your left arm, and enough internal bruising to suggest you went 10 rounds with a Nausicaan, she reported. What were you thinking? That 3,000 people were about to die if someone didn't do something. Buck tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Where's Worf? 2 beds over, getting his own lecture about reckless behavior. Beverly's expression softened slightly. You saved those colonists, Buck. But you also nearly got yourself killed. Wouldn't be the first time. No, but it might have been the last. She pressed a hypospray to his neck, and the pain receded to manageable levels. Captain Picard wants to see you when you're mobile. Let's just say he has opinions about your tactical decisions. 30 minutes later, Buck stood in Picard's ready room. Stood, because sitting still hurt too much, while the captain paced behind his desk like a caged lion. "What you did was reckless, insubordinate, and violated virtually every principle of measured response," Picard began, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You took a Starfleet shuttle into combat against 5 warships without authorization, activated a weapons network without proper clearance, and placed yourself and Lieutenant Worf in mortal danger." "Yes, sir. I did." "And yet—" Picard stopped pacing, turning to face him directly. "You saved 3,000 lives. The Cardassians were preparing to destroy that settlement as a message to other colonies considering Federation protection. Your actions prevented a massacre. So am I in trouble or not?" "Both." Picard's expression was unreadable. "Starfleet Command is furious about the diplomatic complications. The Cardassians are claiming we provoked them by activating military assets in a demilitarized zone. Our response, that we were defending against an unprovoked attack, is undermined by the fact that you activated those assets before they opened fire. They were moving into bombardment position. Anyone with tactical training could see what they were planning." "I agree. But the law requires proof of hostile intent, not merely suspicious positioning." Picard moved to the viewport, hands clasped behind his back. "However, Lieutenant Worf's report makes it clear that you acted to prevent imminent destruction of the colony. And the tactical analysis shows that without your intervention, the Enterprise would have arrived too late. So what happens now? Now you force me to make a choice I was hoping to avoid." Picard turned back to face him. "Buck, you don't fit easily into Starfleet's command structure. You're too independent, too willing to trust your instincts over regulations. In your century, those qualities made you an exceptional pilot. In this one, they make you a liability." Buck felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're kicking me off the Enterprise." "No. I'm offering you an alternative." Picard moved to his desk and activated a console. "There are areas of the Federation where your particular skills would be valuable. Border regions where colonies face threats that Starfleet cannot always prevent due to treaty limitations or resource constraints. Groups like the Maquis, colonists who have chosen to defend themselves rather than rely on Federation protection." "You want me to join the Maquis?" Buck couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. "I want you to understand that they exist because people like you, people who see threats and act rather than deliberating endlessly, have a place in this galaxy. The Maquis operate outside Federation law, which makes them technically criminals. But many of them are simply protecting their homes from Cardassian aggression that our treaties prevent us from addressing directly." Buck studied Picard carefully. "This is a hell of a conversation for a Starfleet captain to be having." "It is. But I've learned that idealism without pragmatism is merely naivety dressed in noble language." Picard's voice carried profound weariness. "I believe in the Federation's principles, Buck. I've dedicated my life to them. But I also recognize that we live in a galaxy that doesn't always conform to those principles. Sometimes, people like you are needed to do what people like me cannot. You're giving me permission to break your rules. I'm acknowledging that you were never going to follow them anyway." A ghost of a smile crossed Picard's features. "However, I'm also offering you a third option. Stay on the Enterprise as a tactical consultant. No uniform, no oath to Starfleet, no requirement to follow regulations that conflict with your judgment. You would advise, observe, and when necessary, when I deem it necessary, you would act." Buck considered the options. Join the Maquis and fight the Cardassians directly. Stay on the Enterprise as a free agent. Or take Daimon Gax's offer and become a mercenary training militias. What would you do? Buck asked. If you were in my position? I would recognize that the question is not about me. Picard met his eyes. But I will tell you this, the Buck Rogers I've observed over these past weeks is a man who fights for people, not for profit or ideology. The colonists on Volan 3 didn't care about Federation principles or Starfleet regulations. They cared that someone was willing to stand between them and destruction. That impulse, to protect rather than profit, is rare and valuable. Before Buck could respond, his comm badge chirped. It was Kira Taban's voice, transmitted from Volan 3. Captain Rogers, I wanted to inform you personally. The Maquis contacted us this morning. They're offering protection, weapons, training, everything we need to defend ourselves against future Cardassian attacks. They say you inspired them, that your actions proved colonies don't have to rely on Starfleet's empty promises. Buck's throat tightened. Kira, I didn't mean. I know. But the offer is compelling. Daimon Gax also renewed his proposal, at double the original price, now that you've proven your tactical worth. And... She paused. A Starfleet admiral wants to court-martial you for unauthorized use of military assets. Wonderful. Buck muttered. But there's something else you should know. Kira continued. We took a vote among the colonists. We're not accepting the Maquis offer. We're not hiring Ferengi mercenaries. We're requesting that the Federation assign you to Volan 3 as our official tactical liaison. Someone who understands both Starfleet's ideals and the reality of defending a border colony. Buck looked at Picard, who seemed unsurprised by this development. I believe Admiral Nechayev at Starfleet Command would accept such an arrangement, Picard said. It would formalize your position, give you authority to act in defense of Federation colonies, and provide a framework for your unique approach to security. In other words, you're making me official so I can keep breaking the rules in ways that help you. I prefer to think of it as channeling your talents toward constructive purposes. Picard's expression grew serious. But understand, Buck, this path puts you directly in the crosshairs. The Cardassians will target you. The Maquis will try to recruit you. The Ferengi will attempt to exploit you. And Starfleet will watch every decision you make, waiting for you to go too far. Buck thought about Sarah Deering, gone for centuries. About his crew on Ranger 3, dead in the cold of space. About a world that no longer existed and a future he never asked for. And then he thought about the Bajoran children he'd saved, about Kira's determination to protect her people, about the choice between comfortable irrelevance and dangerous purpose. I spent 400 years frozen because I volunteered for a mission everyone said was suicide, Buck said finally. Guess some things don't change. Then you accept? On one condition. I don't work for Starfleet. I work with you, when your principles align with my conscience. But when they don't, when I see a threat and you see a treaty violation, I make my own call. Picard extended his hand. Agreed. Welcome to the impossible task of being yourself in a world that doesn't quite understand you, Buck Rogers. As they shook hands, Buck couldn't help but smile. Captain, that's the first thing you've said that actually makes sense. 3 weeks after the incident at Volan 3, Buck Rogers found himself standing in a place that shouldn't exist, a bar called the Rubicon, located in the DMZ between Federation and Cardassian space. The neutral zone had become a haven for people who lived in the gray areas between empires, smugglers, displaced colonists, Maquis operatives, and the occasional Starfleet officer who needed to meet contacts without official scrutiny. Buck nursed a drink that tasted like regret and watched the door. His new position as Special Tactical Liaison had been approved by Starfleet Command with what Picard called extreme reluctance. Admiral Nechayev had made it clear during their subspace conversation that Buck was on the shortest leash in Federation history. One more unauthorized action, and he'd find himself in a penal colony faster than he could say Prime Directive. But the position also gave him access to intelligence networks, defensive resources, and most importantly, the freedom to operate in ways that uniformed officers couldn't. In 3 weeks, he'd advised 4 colonies on defensive strategies, helped coordinate early warning networks, and prevented 2 Cardassian survey missions from becoming reconnaissance for future attacks. He'd also attracted attention from people who saw him as either a valuable asset or a dangerous variable. The door opened, and a human woman entered, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide the military bearing underneath. She scanned the room with professional efficiency before her eyes settled on Buck. Captain Rogers? she said, sliding into the seat across from him. I'm Ro Laren, formerly Lieutenant Ro Laren of Starfleet. Now I represent the Maquis. I know who you are. Buck had read her file. Bajoran, Academy graduate, court-martialed for disobeying orders, eventually joined the Maquis when she couldn't reconcile Starfleet's principles with the reality of abandoned colonists. Question is, what do you want with me? The same thing everyone wants, your help. But unlike the Ferengi, we're not offering profit. Unlike Starfleet, we're not offering regulations. We're offering you a chance to actually make a difference. I'm already making a difference. Are you? Ro leaned forward, her expression intense. You've helped a few colonies shore up their defenses. That's admirable. But you're still working within Starfleet's framework, following their rules about what you can and cannot do. Meanwhile, Cardassian forces are massing along the border. Intelligence suggests they're planning a major offensive within 6 months. Multiple colonies hit simultaneously, overwhelming Starfleet's ability to respond. Buck kept his expression neutral. Where'd you get this intelligence? Sources inside the Cardassian military. Defectors who see the occupation of Bajorans as a moral stain they can't ignore. She pulled out a PDD and slid it across the table. 16 targets. Coordinated strikes designed to occur during a diplomatic conference where Starfleet's senior commanders will be focused on treaty negotiations. The Cardassians will present the attacks as responses to Maquis aggression, giving them political cover. Buck scanned the PDD. The target list included Volan 3. You're showing me this because you want something in return. We want you to train our forces. Most Maquis operatives are colonists. Farmers, engineers, families who picked up weapons because they had no choice. They're brave, but they're not soldiers. You've got combat experience spanning centuries of human warfare. You understand tactics that Starfleet's Academy doesn't teach anymore. Because those tactics don't align with Federation principles. Exactly. Ro's voice carried conviction. We don't have the luxury of principles, Captain. We have children to protect, homes to defend, and an enemy that sees our existence as an affront. The Federation tells us to trust in diplomacy while our settlements burn. We're asking you to help us survive. Buck set down the PDD. You know what happens if I agree? Starfleet will revoke my liaison position. Picard will have to disavow me. I'll be officially labeled a criminal. Yes. But you'll also save thousands of lives. Ro's eyes held the same intensity Buck had seen in Kira Taban's, the desperation of someone who'd lost too much and refused to lose more. You told the Bajorans on Volan 3 that adapting doesn't mean surrendering who you are. The Maquis are people who refuse to surrender their identity as Federation citizens even when the Federation has abandoned them. We're fighting for the ideals Starfleet claims to represent but won't defend. Before Buck could respond, the bar's lights flickered. A Cardassian emerged from the shadows near the back entrance. Gul Torin, the same officer who'd probed Volan 3's defenses weeks earlier. He moved with predatory confidence, 2 armed guards flanking him. Captain Rogers? Torin said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent bar. And the infamous Ro Laren. How convenient to find you together. It saves me the trouble of tracking you down separately. Buck's hand moved toward the phaser on his hip, but Ro touched his arm, stopping him. The Rubicon has strict neutrality protocols. No violence or you get spaced. He knows that. Torin smiled, all teeth and malice. Indeed. I'm simply here to deliver a message. Captain Rogers, your interference at Volan 3 cost the Cardassian Union considerable face. My superiors are displeased. They've authorized me to offer you an alternative to becoming a permanent enemy of our empire. Not interested, Buck said flatly. You haven't heard the offer. We're prepared to guarantee the safety of every colony you're currently advising, in writing, verified by third-party oversight, if you agree to cease your defensive preparations and return to the Enterprise. You want me to abandon those people so you can attack them later without resistance. We want you to recognize reality. Torin leaned against a nearby table, casual and confident. The border colonies exist in disputed territory. Treaties say one thing, but practical control says another. The Federation cannot protect them all, and your presence is delaying the inevitable while emboldening resistance that will ultimately cost more lives. So I should let you roll over them without a fight? You should recognize that your primitive tactics, brave as they were with that shuttle, cannot prevent the forces we're assembling. When we move, we will crush any resistance completely. The colonists' only hope for survival is surrender, not defiance. Torin's expression hardened. But if you continue training them, continue encouraging their resistance, then we will interpret their actions as yours. And we will respond to you, not them. Buck stood slowly, keeping his hands visible but his posture combat-ready. Let me make sure I understand. You're threatening to escalate attacks on civilians because I'm teaching them how to defend themselves? I'm offering you a chance to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Walk away, Captain Rogers. Return to your own time's ideals and leave this century's conflicts to those who understand them. You know what I understood about conflicts in my time? Buck's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. Bullies respect strength. And appeasement just makes them hungrier. He took a step toward Torin, ignoring Ro's warning hand on his shoulder. So here's my counteroffer. You pull your forces back from the border, stop harassing colonists, and maybe I'll consider not making your life a living hell. Torin's guards reached for their weapons, but the Cardassian held up a hand, stopping them. Spirited. I see why the colonists find you inspiring. But inspiration doesn't stop disruptor fire, Captain. When the offensive begins, and it will begin, remember that I offered you a way to save them. He departed with his guards, leaving Buck and Ro alone in the tense silence. That went well, Ro said dryly. He was bluffing. Trying to scare me into backing off. Maybe. Or maybe he's telling the truth about the offensive. She studied him carefully. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Buck looked at the PDD still sitting on the table, 16 colonies marked for destruction. Then he thought about Picard's warning, about Starfleet's regulations, about the careful balance he was supposed to maintain between principles and pragmatism. I'm going to need supplies, Buck said finally. Weapons, training materials, communications equipment. Can the Maquis provide that? We can. But once you accept our help, there's no going back. Starfleet will know. Yeah. Buck picked up the PDD. But those 16 colonies won't care about my career when the Cardassians come. They'll care that someone was willing to help them fight back. Ro extended her hand. Welcome to the Maquis, Captain Rogers. Or should I say, welcome to the right side of history, even if it's the wrong side of the law. As they shook hands, Buck felt the weight of the choice settling on his shoulders. He just committed himself to becoming exactly what Starfleet feared, a warrior operating outside their control, making decisions based on instinct rather than regulation. But he'd also committed himself to protecting people who had no one else. Somewhere, he thought, Admiral Nechayev was probably already drafting the arrest warrant. Back on the Enterprise, Captain Picard sat in his ready room reviewing Buck's latest intelligence report when Commander Riker entered. Captain, you need to see this. Riker activated the view screen. Starfleet intelligence intercepted communications from the Rubicon. Buck met with Ro Laren and accepted Maquis assistance in preparing border colonies for defense. Picard closed his eyes briefly. I see. Admiral Nechayev is demanding we detain him immediately. She's calling it treason. And what do you call it, number one? Riker was silent for a long moment. I call it a man doing what he thinks is right, even when it costs him everything. Just like you taught me, Captain. That's not what I taught you. I taught you to find ways to do what's right within the system, not outside it. With respect, sir, sometimes the system doesn't have answers. Sometimes you need someone willing to break the rules to protect the people those rules are supposed to serve. Riker met Picard's gaze steadily. Buck's not betraying the Federation. He's protecting its citizens when we can't. Picard stood, moving to the viewport where stars streamed past in their endless dance. If I don't arrest him, I'm complicit in his actions. If I do arrest him, those 16 colonies will be defenseless when the Cardassians attack. Sounds like you're faced with choosing between regulations and lives, Captain. What would you tell someone else to do? I would tell them to find a third option. Diplomacy, negotiation, a peaceful solution that doesn't require choosing between law and morality. And if no third option exists? Picard didn't answer immediately. Finally, he turned back to Riker. Then I would tell them to choose what they can live with. And I can live with many things, number one, but sacrificing civilians to preserve my own moral comfort is not among them. So what are your orders? My orders are that we continue our patrol of this sector, maintaining our current trajectory and speed. If Buck Rogers happens to be operating in areas we don't patrol, well, space is vast, and our resources are limited. Riker allowed himself a slight smile. Understood, Captain? Should I inform Admiral Nechayev that we're pursuing the fugitive? Inform the Admiral that we are conducting a thorough investigation and will apprehend Captain Rogers the moment he enters Federation jurisdiction. Picard's expression was carefully neutral. Make sure Buck knows to stay out of Federation jurisdiction. Aye, sir. After Riker departed, Picard returned to the viewport, watching the stars and wondering when exactly he'd become the kind of captain who bent rules to protect people who broke them. Perhaps, he thought, that was simply what happened when you spent too much time around men from centuries past who remembered that sometimes, survival required defying the very principles you claimed to serve. Or perhaps Buck Rogers was teaching them all a lesson they'd forgotten, that idealism without action was just another word for cowardice dressed in noble language. The Cardassian offensive began exactly when Ro Laren's intelligence had predicted, during the Federation Cardassian Diplomatic Conference on Aldebaran III, when Starfleet's senior command was focused on treaty negotiations and fleet deployments were minimized to demonstrate good faith. Buck Rogers watched it unfold from the command center he'd established on Ronera Prime, a Maquis stronghold that had become the coordination hub for 16 colonies preparing for the worst. Tactical displays showed Cardassian warships dropping out of warp at multiple targets simultaneously, a perfectly synchronized assault designed to overwhelm Starfleet's response capabilities. They're hitting all 16 targets, reported Khalida, a former Starfleet tactical officer who joined the Maquis after watching her homeworld abandoned by treaty. Just like the intelligence predicted. Volan 3, Hackton 7, the demilitarized zone settlements, all under attack. Buck studied the displays, his mind processing vectors, timing, force deployments. 3 weeks of training Maquis cells, establishing communication networks, and pre-positioning defensive resources was about to be tested against an enemy that had spent decades perfecting occupation warfare. Activate Plan Theta, Buck ordered. All colonies execute defensive protocols. Maquis cells, you know your assignments. Let's show these bastards that border colonists aren't easy prey. The command center erupted into controlled chaos as officers relayed orders across subspace channels designed to avoid Cardassian intercept. Buck had borrowed tactics from guerrilla warfare throughout Earth's history: decentralized command, pre-positioned caches, coordinated harassment rather than direct confrontation. The Cardassians expected either Starfleet's measured response or civilian panic. They were about to get neither. On Volan 3, Kira Taban watched Cardassian warships enter orbit and felt a familiar cold terror, the same fear she'd felt watching her homeworld burn under occupation. But this time was different. This time, they were ready. Activate the Trojan Horse satellites, she ordered. The defense satellites that Buck had activated weeks earlier suddenly showed their true purpose. What the Cardassians believed they'd neutralized during their reconnaissance were actually decoys. The real weapons platforms, disguised as communications relays and sensor buoys, powered up with targeting locks already established. Surprise phaser fire tore into Cardassian shields from unexpected angles. The warships scrambled to respond, but Buck's training had emphasized the importance of the first strike. By the time the Cardassians adapted, half their shields were compromised. On the surface, Bajoran colonists who'd spent 3 weeks learning Buck's crash course in defensive tactics moved into prearranged positions. They weren't soldiers, they were farmers and engineers and teachers. But they understood their land, their settlement, and they'd learned that courage combined with preparation could overcome superior firepower. The pattern repeated across all 16 target colonies. On Hackton 7, Maquis operatives used the terrain Buck had helped them fortify, turning the settlement into a maze of overlapping fields of fire. On Dorvan V, colonists executed evacuation protocols that moved civilians into hardened shelters while armed defenders made every meter of advance costly for Cardassian ground forces. The Cardassians had planned for overwhelming force against minimal resistance. Instead, they encountered coordinated defense that bled their assault forces and stalled their timetables. Cardassian commanders are requesting reinforcements, Khalida reported, unable to keep satisfaction from her voice. Their casualty rates are exceeding projections. They'll adapt, Buck warned. They always do. What's Starfleet's response time? Enterprise is 40 minutes out from the nearest target. The rest of the fleet is scrambling from the diplomatic conference. Estimate 2 to 3 hours before significant forces arrive. 2 to 3 hours. The colonists had to hold for 2 to 3 hours against an enemy that was now angry, embarrassed, and willing to commit atrocities to regain the initiative. Open a channel to all Maquis cells, Buck ordered. Tell them. The communication console exploded in sparks. Khalida jerked back, her face singed. Jamming! The Cardassians are flooding subspace with interference. We've lost contact with half the colonies. Buck swore. He'd anticipated jamming, but not this quickly or comprehensively. The Cardassians were adapting faster than his models had predicted. Switch to backup frequencies. Tight beam transmissions to avoid. Captain Rogers. A new voice cut through the chaos, cold, familiar, transmitted on a priority channel that bypassed the jamming. Ghoul Torin appeared on the main view screen, his expression triumphant. I told you resistance would be futile. Your clever defenses have cost us ships and soldiers, but you cannot win. Surrender now, and I will allow the colonists to evacuate before we destroy their settlements. You'll forgive me if I don't trust Cardassian promises. Buck shot back. Then trust mathematics. You have 16 colonies defended by civilians and Maquis terrorists. I have 40 warships and the authorization to use whatever force necessary to eliminate your resistance. Even now, I'm deploying orbital bombardment platforms that will reduce your precious colonies to ash. Torin leaned forward. You cannot save them all, Captain Rogers. But you can save some. Surrender yourself to Cardassian custody, and I will withdraw from 8 colonies of your choosing. Buck felt every eye in the command center on him. The offer was designed to break him, sacrifice himself, or watch half the colonies burn. You're bluffing, Buck said. Orbital bombardment of civilian settlements violates every treaty the Federation and Cardassia have signed. You'd give the Federation justification for war. Would I? Torin's smile was reptilian. Or would I be responding to Maquis terrorism coordinated by a rogue Starfleet officer? The Enterprise is monitoring this transmission, Captain Rogers. Captain Picard knows exactly what you've done, aided terrorists, armed illegal militias, violated Federation law. Even if I destroy every colony you've poisoned with your resistance, Starfleet will blame you, not us. The tactical display flickered, showing new contacts. Torin wasn't bluffing about the bombardment platforms, massive weapons systems designed to turn planetary surfaces into molten slag. They were entering position over the 8 most vulnerable colonies, including Volan 3. Buck's mind raced through scenarios. If he surrendered, Torin would withdraw from 8 colonies, but the Cardassians would learn everything Buck knew about the defensive networks. The remaining 8 colonies would fall within hours. If he refused, the bombardment would begin immediately, killing thousands. There was no good option. Just varying degrees of catastrophe. You have 60 seconds to decide, Torin said. After that I begin bombardment with Volan 3. 3,000 Bajoran refugees who trusted you, Captain Rogers. Their blood will be on your hands. 45 seconds. Buck looked at Khalida, at the other Maquis operatives, at people who believed his training would save them. He thought about Kiritaban and the Bajoran children playing in gardens they'd cultivated. About colonists who'd chosen to stand and fight rather than abandon their homes. 30 seconds. And he thought about Sarah Deering, centuries dead. About promises he'd made in another lifetime to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. About the fighter pilot who'd volunteered for a suicide mission because some things were worth dying for. 15 seconds. All right, Buck said quietly. You win. I'll... Gul Torin, this is Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise. Picard's voice cut through the transmission like a phaser through hull plating. I am placing you under arrest for war crimes against Federation civilians. Surrender immediately or I will open fire. The view screen split, showing both Torin's shocked expression and Picard's cold fury. Behind the Enterprise, the tactical display revealed something impossible. A dozen Starfleet vessels dropping out of warp in coordinated formation around the 16 colonies. Picard. Torin recovered his composure. You have no authority here. These are disputed territories, and we are responding to terrorist actions by the Maquis. You are bombarding civilian settlements in violation of 17 interstellar laws and 3 treaties your government has signed. Picard's voice carried absolute conviction. Furthermore, sensor logs will show you initiated hostilities while Starfleet vessels were positioned to defend Federation protectorates. That constitutes an act of war. You're bluffing. The Federation won't go to war over border colonies and terrorists. Perhaps not. But we will defend our citizens from genocide. The Enterprise's weapons locked onto the nearest bombardment platform. You have 10 seconds to withdraw your forces, Gul Torin. After that, I will interpret your continued presence as confirmation of hostile intent, and I will respond with overwhelming force. Buck watched the standoff, barely breathing. Picard was risking everything, his career, his ship, potentially war with the Cardassian Union, to protect colonies and Maquis operatives that Starfleet had officially abandoned. Torin's jaw worked silently, calculations running behind his eyes. Finally, he spoke. This isn't over, Picard. The Cardassian Union will remember this provocation. And I will remember that you threatened to murder 3,000 refugees. Picard's expression didn't soften. Withdraw. Now. The Cardassian vessels pulled back, jumping to warp in a coordinated retreat that left the 16 colonies battered but standing. The bombardment platforms withdrew with them, their terrible threat unrealized. Buck sagged against the console, adrenaline draining from his system like water from a breached hull. Captain Rogers, Picard's voice continued, now addressing Buck directly. I am ordering you to report to the Enterprise immediately. You are under arrest for violation of Starfleet regulations, aiding a terrorist organization, and conduct unbecoming of a Federation liaison. Understood, Captain? Buck managed a weak smile. For what it's worth, thank you. Don't thank me yet. Admiral Nechayev will probably have us both court-martialed. Picard's expression softened slightly. But we'll face that together. Enterprise out. The transmission ended. Khalida stared at Buck, confused. He just saved us. Why is he arresting you? Because that's how Starfleet works. Buck explained. He has to maintain the appearance of following regulations even when he's bending them into pretzels. I break the rules, he arrests me. Everyone gets to pretend the system still works. And then what? Then I'd probably get a lecture about protocols, a slap on the wrist, and assigned to some remote outpost where I can't cause more trouble. Buck headed toward the transport coordinates. Or they throw me in a penal colony. Either way, those 16 colonies are still standing, and that's what matters. As the transporter beam took him, Buck's last thought was that the 24th century was more complicated than he'd ever imagined, but also more human than he'd given it credit for. Even Picard, with all his principles and protocols, knew when rules had to bend for lives to be saved. The courtroom at Starfleet Command was smaller than Buck expected, just a panel of 3 admirals, a few observers, and the weight of 400 years of human evolution judging whether a man from the past belonged in the future. Admiral Alina Nechayev sat in the center, flanked by Admiral Tan Man and Admiral Haftel. Captain Picard stood to Buck's right as both witness and character reference, his dress uniform immaculate, his expression carefully neutral. "Captain William Rogers," Nechayev began, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone who'd spent decades enforcing regulations. "You stand accused of violating your liaison agreement with Starfleet, providing material support to the Maquis terrorist organization, and independently initiating military action against Cardassian forces. How do you plead?" Buck stood at attention, the military bearing from his own century still ingrained despite everything. "Guilty on all counts, Admiral." A murmur ran through the observers. Picard's jaw tightened slightly. They'd discussed Buck mounting a defense, arguing necessity or unclear jurisdiction. But Buck had refused. "You're not even going to attempt to justify your actions?" Nechayev asked. "No, ma'am. I knew the rules when I broke them. I made a choice to prioritize lives over regulations. You can agree or disagree with that choice, but I won't insult your intelligence by pretending I didn't know exactly what I was doing." Nechayev studied him for a long moment. "Captain Picard, you recommended Captain Rogers for the liaison position. Do you wish to offer testimony in his defense?" Picard stepped forward. "I do, Admiral. Captain Rogers acted in accordance with the core principles that define the Federation: protection of sentient life, defense of the vulnerable, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. While his methods violated protocols, his intentions were entirely consistent with Starfleet values." "Intentions don't negate violations, Captain," Admiral Haftel interjected. "If every officer decided their personal judgment superseded regulations, we'd have chaos." "With respect, Admiral, we already have chaos." Picard's voice remained measured but forceful. "The Cardassian offensive targeted 16 civilian settlements, with overwhelming military force. Standard Starfleet response protocols would have resulted in our arrival after the colonies were destroyed. Captain Rogers's preparations, while technically illegal, saved thousands of lives. By arming terrorists and conducting unauthorized military operations," Nechayev countered. "Captain Picard, I understand your desire to defend Captain Rogers. But we cannot excuse vigilantism simply because it produces favorable outcomes. The Federation is built on law, not individual heroics." "Then perhaps our laws need examination," Picard said quietly. "Captain Rogers comes from an era when individual action was often necessary for survival. We claim to have evolved beyond that necessity, but have we truly? Or have we simply created elaborate rules that let us feel civilized while others suffer?" The courtroom fell silent. Buck glanced at Picard, surprised by the captain's willingness to challenge Starfleet doctrine so directly. Admiral Tan Man leaned forward. "Captain Rogers, I've reviewed your tactical reports. Your defensive preparations were impressive. Unconventional, certainly, but effective. The question before this tribunal is whether effectiveness justifies illegality." "I'm not asking for justification, Admiral," Buck said. "I'm asking for consistency. Starfleet talks about protecting civilians and defending Federation values. But when push came to shove, your treaties and protocols were going to let those 16 colonies burn. I didn't have the luxury of waiting for you to debate proper procedure while people died. So you took matters into your own hands," Nechayev said. "Decided you knew better than centuries of carefully developed law and tradition." "No, Admiral. I decided that when law and tradition conflict with survival, people have a right to choose survival." Buck met her gaze steadily. "You can court-martial me. You can lock me up or send me back to cryosleep or whatever punishment fits your regulations. But you can't tell me I was wrong to save those people when nobody else was going to." Nechayev's expression was unreadable. "Captain Picard, When the Cardassian offensive began, you mobilized 12 Starfleet vessels in direct violation of deployment orders that restricted fleet movements during the diplomatic conference. How do you justify that decision? I don't justify it, Admiral. I made a command decision that lives were more important than diplomatic theater. If that violates regulations, I accept full responsibility. So we have 2 officers, Admiral Haftel said slowly, both admitting to violations, both claiming moral necessity as defense. Where does this end? Do we simply abandon all structure and let every captain decide which laws apply to them? Structure without compassion is tyranny, Picard replied. Laws exist to serve people, Admiral, not the reverse. When our regulations actively prevent us from protecting civilians, those regulations must be questioned. The 3 admirals exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, Nechayev spoke. This tribunal will recess for deliberation. Captain Rogers, Captain Picard, you are dismissed while we consider our verdict. In the corridor outside, Buck leaned against the wall while Picard stood with characteristic perfect posture. You didn't have to put your career on the line for me, Buck said. I put my career on the line for principles I claim to believe in, Picard corrected. You simply forced me to examine whether I truly meant what I've been saying all these years about Federation values. And I realized that somewhere along the way, we've become very good at talking about ideals while finding reasons not to act on them. Picard's expression was troubled. The Prime Directive exists to prevent cultural contamination. But we've extended it so far that we now hesitate to defend our own citizens from genocide because it might violate diplomatic protocols. Welcome to the confusion I've been living with since I woke up, Buck said wryly. You people have built an amazing civilization. But you've also wrapped it in so many rules that you can barely move. Perhaps we needed someone from a simpler time to remind us that rules serve people, not the other way around. Picard turned to face him. Whatever the tribunal decides, Buck, you've changed how I think about command. About the balance between principle and action. Yeah? And what conclusion did you reach? That sometimes the hardest thing to do is something. That restraint has value, but paralysis does not. Picard's slight smile was almost sad. That I've been so focused on being the perfect Starfleet captain that I've forgotten what it means to simply be human. Before Buck could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Commander Riker emerged, gesturing them back inside. The tribunal had reached its verdict. Admiral Nechayev's expression gave nothing away as Buck and Picard returned to their positions. This tribunal has reached a decision, she began. Captain Rogers, your actions violated numerous Starfleet regulations and placed this organization in significant diplomatic jeopardy. By any standard measure, you should face severe punishment. Buck braced himself. However, Nechayev continued, we cannot ignore that your violations saved approximately 12,000 civilian lives. Furthermore, Captain Picard's tactical analysis demonstrates that standard Starfleet response would have resulted in catastrophic losses. She paused, letting the words settle. Therefore, this tribunal finds you guilty of all charges, but recommends leniency based on mitigating circumstances. You will be formally reprimanded, and your liaison position is hereby terminated. Buck nodded, accepting the judgment. However, Nechayev's voice carried a note Buck couldn't quite identify. Starfleet recognizes the need for officers who can operate in unconventional circumstances. We are creating a new position, Border Defense Coordinator. This position will have authority to prepare Federation colonies for potential hostile action, coordinate with local defense forces, and act independently when time-sensitive threats emerge. Buck blinked, certain he'd misheard. The position operates under different regulations than standard Starfleet assignments. Nechayev explained. More autonomy, less oversight, because we've learned that border regions require flexibility that traditional command structures don't accommodate. Captain Rogers, we're offering you this position. If you accept, you'll have official authority to do what you've been doing illegally, with the understanding that you'll still be held accountable for your decisions. You're promoting me? Buck couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. We're acknowledging reality, Admiral Tonman said. You don't fit in traditional Starfleet, Captain Rogers. But that doesn't mean you don't have value to the Federation. We need people who can think like you, who can act decisively when our careful deliberations would cost lives. This is conditional, of course, Nechayev added. You will submit regular reports. You will not engage in offensive operations without authorization. And you will remember that while we're giving you latitude, you still represent the Federation. Your actions reflect on all of us. Buck looked at Picard, who gave a barely perceptible nod of encouragement. I accept, Buck said. On one condition, I want final say on which colonies I defend and how I defend them. No committee decisions, no waiting for approval while people die. Nechayev's eyes narrowed. That's asking for significant trust, Captain. It is. But you're asking me to defend people with one hand tied behind my back if I have to clear every decision through Starfleet bureaucracy. Either you trust my judgment or you don't. The admirals exchanged glances again. Finally, Nechayev nodded. Agreed. But understand, Captain Rogers, this trust can be revoked at any time if you abuse it. One unjustified civilian casualty, one unnecessary escalation, and you will find yourself in a penal colony before you can say court-martial. Are we clear? Crystal, Admiral. Then this tribunal is adjourned. Captain Rogers, report to Starbase 375 for briefing on your new assignment. Captain Picard. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. You are also formally reprimanded for violating deployment orders. However, given the outcome, this reprimand will not affect your service record or command status. Dismissed. Outside Starfleet Command, Buck and Picard stood looking up at the San Francisco sky, the same sky Buck had flown through 4 centuries earlier, now home to orbital platforms and shuttles that made his old fighter jets look like children's toys. So, Buck said, Border Defense Coordinator. Think they're setting me up to fail? Undoubtedly, Picard replied. Admiral Nechayev is many things, but sentimental is not among them. She's giving you enough rope to either save the Federation's border colonies or hang yourself. Comforting. But honest. Picard turned to face him. Buck, you're going to be operating in areas where Starfleet's ideals clash with survival instincts. Where diplomacy fails and violence beckons. You'll have to make impossible choices with incomplete information and face consequences regardless of what you decide. Sounds like every mission I ever flew. Perhaps. But this time, you won't have the luxury of blaming outdated regulations or claiming ignorance of Federation principles. You'll own your decisions completely. Picard extended his hand. Don't let the authority corrupt you. Don't become so focused on winning that you forget what you're fighting for. Buck shook his hand firmly. And don't you forget what you learned from all this, that sometimes perfect is the enemy of good enough. Sometimes you have to act even when you're not certain. I won't forget. Picard smiled slightly. Though I suspect my way of remembering will involve considerably more diplomatic consideration than yours. Probably for the best. Galaxy needs both of us. The guy who thinks things through and the guy who acts before thinking gets people killed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 men separated by centuries but united by the fundamental challenge of leadership. Protecting people in a universe that didn't always cooperate with noble intentions. Buck, Picard said finally. When you went into cryosleep, you thought you were saying goodbye to everything you knew. But perhaps you were actually saying hello to something you were always meant to become. Not just a fighter pilot from the past, but a bridge between humanity's warrior heritage and its enlightened future. That's pretty philosophical for a guy who just got reprimanded. I've had an enlightening few weeks. Picard's expression turned serious. Don't be a stranger, Captain Rogers. The Enterprise will be in the border regions regularly. And I suspect we'll both benefit from comparing notes on the impossible task of being principled pragmatists in an imperfect galaxy. I'll keep that in mind. Buck glanced back at Starfleet Command, where admirals were probably already regretting their decision to give him official authority. Though something tells me they're going to regret creating this position when I start doing exactly what they're afraid I'll do. Undoubtedly. But they'll also be grateful when your unorthodox methods save lives that regulations would have sacrificed. Picard clasped his shoulder briefly. Alive long and prosper, Buck Rogers. And try not to start any wars we can't finish. No promises, Captain. But I'll do my best. As Picard departed, Buck turned toward the transport station that would take him to Starbase 375 and his new assignment. Somewhere out there, 16 colonies were rebuilding, defended by people who'd learned they could stand up to empires if they had the courage and preparation. And somewhere out there, the Cardassians were planning their next move, calculating how to remove the troublesome human from the 20th century who disrupted their expansion. Buck Rogers smiled. Let them plan. He'd spent 400 years frozen, everyone he loved turned to dust, his entire world transformed beyond recognition. But he'd survived. Adapted. Found his purpose in a future that hadn't wanted him. The fighter pilot from 1987 had become the Border Defense Coordinator of 2367, and the galaxy was about to learn that some things transcended time. Like the simple truth that when you threaten people Buck Rogers has sworn to protect, you'd better be prepared for a fight. Buck Rogers had gone to sleep in a world divided by ideology and competition, where nations measured strength in nuclear arsenals and space was the final frontier for human ambition. He woke to a galaxy united under principles of cooperation, where humanity had joined a community of species bound by shared ideals rather than mutual fear. The transition should have been impossible. A man so fundamentally shaped by 20th century pragmatism should have been crushed by 24th century idealism, or rejected it entirely as naive fantasy. But Buck discovered something unexpected in the Federation's carefully maintained optimism. The same courage that had driven him to volunteer for a suicide mission in 1987. It took courage to believe in diplomacy when violence was easier. It took strength to choose restraint when every instinct screamed for action. The Federation's principles weren't weakness disguised as virtue. They were the hardest path humanity had ever chosen, maintained through constant vigilance against the darker impulses that had nearly destroyed Earth. But Buck also taught the Federation something it had begun to forget, that principles without the will to defend them are merely words. That idealism unsupported by action becomes complicity in injustice. That evolution doesn't erase the need for warriors, it transforms what they fight for. Captain Picard, Lieutenant Worf, Commander Data, and countless others had their assumptions challenged by a man who remembered when survival required hard choices and quick action. Buck didn't diminish their ideals, he sharpened them, forcing the Federation to examine whether it truly believed its own rhetoric, or merely used it as justification for inaction. The 16 colonies stood as testament to this synthesis of past and future. They survived not through abandoning Federation principles, but by embracing the warrior spirit that had carried humanity through its darkest hours. Buck Rogers became the bridge between who humanity had been and who they aspired to be, proving that you could honor both without surrendering either. As the newly appointed Border Defense Coordinator, Buck faced an uncertain future. The Cardassians would test him. The Maquis would seek to recruit him. Starfleet would watch for signs he'd gone too far. And through it all, he'd have to navigate the impossible balance between action and restraint, between protecting lives and preserving principles. But Buck Rogers had survived the impossible before. He'd outlasted death itself, crossing centuries in frozen sleep to wake in a world that should have rejected him. If he could find his place in that transformed galaxy, he could handle whatever challenges the border regions threw at him. The fighter pilot from 1987 had become something new, not quite Starfleet, not quite civilian, not quite the man he'd been, but not entirely different either. He was Buck Rogers, defender of colonies, coordinator of impossible defenses, and living proof that humanity's past and future could coexist. And somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, new challenges were already forming, Threats that would require both Picard's wisdom and Buck's willingness to act. Conflicts that would test whether the Federation's ideals could survive contact with a galaxy that didn't always play by civilized rules. But for now, Buck Rogers had found what he'd been seeking since waking in the 24th century: purpose, belonging, and the knowledge that even 400 years couldn't erase what made him who he was. Some things transcend time. Honor. Courage. The willingness to stand between civilians and destruction, regardless of personal cost. Buck Rogers embodied all of them, a man out of time who'd become exactly what the future needed. Live long and prosper. Hit that subscribe button for more interesting stories. Thank you.